Welcome to Theories and Problems in Visual Art. This is lecture 16 in the concept series on knowledge. The question here is whether or not you could say that your artwork produces knowledge, or that there's knowledge to be had in it or to be gotten from it, and how the visual art itself is related to that knowledge. Most of this lecture I'm going to spend on this part 2, listing 6 different kinds of knowledge. And then if knowledge doesn't seem like the right word and you want to find another way of talking about the kind of thing that your artwork produces by way of meaning, I have a section on alternatives to knowledge. And then the last part of the lecture is on deconstruction. It was a philosophic movement or strategy because it has some interesting things to contribute to this question. If visual art involves research, as in the previous lecture, then it should produce knowledge, because all research produces knowledge by definition. Research in physics produces knowledge of matter. Research in social sciences produces knowledge of culture. It's not clear, however, what kind of knowledge visual art produces. It's possible that it's best to think of it as a special kind of knowledge because it's visual, but then it's not clear exactly what that means, kind of knowledge. I'll give 2 artist examples to make this concrete. Fred Wilson's the first example. I have more on him in Concepts Lecture 2. He researches what museums have kept in storage and what they've ignored, and he designs exhibitions that reveal the politics and the history of the museums. This is an exhibition of dime store Indians, or also called cigar store Indians, which are arranged facing objects in the collection of the Maryland Historical Society. Second artist I want to take as an example is Mark Dion. He also works in museums, and he redisplays objects in their collections into new configurations. But his work doesn't always have a political meaning. It's often more general. It has something to say about the ways that museums display things. This is a detail from a piece he did called Thames Dig, where he had a number of volunteers pick up objects from the mud on the banks of the Thames River in London, and then he arranged them according to different criteria, like up at the top, bottle caps by color, also by material and by size and so on. And then he put them all in vitrines, glass cases, in a very elaborate Victorian-style museum display cabinet, and showed it in a museum. Wilson's and Dion's exhibitions seem to produce new knowledge about museums' histories and their prejudices and their assumptions and so on. But in Wilson's case, the knowledge can usually be put in words. You can say something like, this museum has ignored African diaspora, or this museum has made the ethnicity of its security staff invisible, that kind of thing. With Dion, you can't usually put the knowledge into words, but you reflect on the ways that museums have stored and displayed objects and the kinds of meanings that they've tried to produce by arranging objects. So, is the artwork itself the knowledge that it produces? In which case, does knowledge take the form of visual objects? Are those installations and exhibitions by Wilson and Dion, are they themselves actually, as visual objects, the knowledge in question? Or, and this seems maybe more plausible at first, does the artwork suggest the knowledge? In other words, you look at the exhibition, you look at the display cases, and that suggests to you different conclusions. And if that's the case, what do the visual objects themselves mean once you've interpreted them? So this is the fundamental choice. There's actually 2 questions here on the right-hand column. Is the artwork itself knowledge in some way, or does the artwork suggest knowledge? Very few writers, critics, historians, theorists have said whether they think that art is knowledge or that it embodies knowledge. If you say that work is knowledge, that means that visual qualities of the art are themselves a form of knowledge. The colors and the shape and the textures are themselves actually the knowledge content. If you say that work embodies knowledge, that means that your instructors will work with you to articulate the information in your artwork so you can express yourself clearly, so that you can get your message across, but that the object that you make is itself not a form of knowledge. So if someone says about your work in a critique, oh, I could see this has a, it's a political statement and it says this or that, then you can ask yourself this kind of question. Is the work that you produced actually as a visual object a kind of knowledge? Or is the knowledge something that came out of the discussion, out of the critique, and was a conclusion drawn about your work by other people in the class or by the instructor? In which case, what is the work itself? How is the work itself related to that conclusion? Notice in both of these the stress on form. So the question then maybe is, what are the forms of knowledge? What are the different kinds of knowledge? I have 6 different kinds of knowledge here. There aren't really accepted lists of kinds or forms of knowledge, but these are 6 that I assembled because they are all ones that have been used to describe what happens in visual art. Tacit knowledge is something that you don't quite know yet, but you may be able to know it or to describe it eventually. The most influential writer on this is the philosopher of science Michael Polanyi. So he wrote about scientists and saying that tacit knowledge is really important in a typical science lab, because that's just an image that I Googled, of course. But he said that scientists don't work the way most people think they do. That is, they don't start out with a hypothesis and say, I have an idea I want to test. I'd better build a lot of lab apparatus and do an experiment to test that. Polanyi says that it's more complicated than that. Scientists often don't really quite know what they're doing, but as they work, they articulate their experiments, and the ideas and the theories and the hypotheses become clearer and clearer. So at points along the way, they may not be clear enough to explain or publish. That's tacit knowledge. Tacit knowledge, in this way of thinking, is part and parcel of the way that science actually works, and by implication art, although Polanyi wasn't writing about art. Tacit knowledge is something that's been applied by artists to describe the kind of practice that they experience themselves. Visual knowledge would be a different kind or form or type of knowledge. If there are different kinds of knowledge and visual art has the capacity to produce knowledge in some way, then maybe it's just best to call it visual knowledge. So if there's a kind of knowledge that pertains just to the visual, then it probably should be just called visual knowledge. But then the question is, what could that possibly mean? When you look at a painting or a sculpture, is it the color or the texture or the materiality or the volume, the movement? Is that actually giving you knowledge in some way? Is that telling you something? It seems like knowledge is not really the right word for what happens when you look at visual art, and it seems like visual knowledge is not a sensible expression. In other words, it's the inappropriate application of that adjective visual to the word knowledge. It's an odd pairing at the very least, but it's also a way of acknowledging the fact that the visual might have a way of helping us learn about the world that doesn't happen in language. If you don't like associating visual art with language, if for you visual art is a non-linguistic, non-verbal activity, fundamentally, then you might prefer to say that visual art is concerned with feelings and emotions and moods and other affective states. And then possibly it might make sense to say that visual art has affective knowledge. The problem here is that affect, like the purely visual, it's nonverbal, it's outside of language. Affect is by definition somatic or embodied reaction to the world. There's a lecture coming up, lecture C16, entirely on affect theory. So affect is something that's a common word and a common goal in contemporary art making. Not always associated, though, with knowledge, because affect really is something that is meant to be outside of knowledge, in the sense that it's outside of reason and it's outside of cognition. On the other hand, you do sometimes say that people have emotional wisdom. So some people can have affective knowledge in that sense, and possibly that does pertain to visual art. Propositional knowledge is the most common definition of knowledge. If this if this lecture were given in a university and not in an art school, you probably wouldn't have heard about those first three or the two that I'm about to mention after this, because for many people, propositional knowledge simply is knowledge. It's an unnecessary qualifying adjective, propositional, because all knowledge happens in propositions. If you look it up in a dictionary, that's the kind of understanding of knowledge that you're going to get. And so in this way of thinking, knowledge simply is logical statements in language. Logical statement would include sentences like the sun is bright. So as long as you're speaking rationally and using reason, then you can produce propositional knowledge in this case. You may say things that are wrong. That's another issue, whether it's true or false. But the form of knowledge is propositions. That would be the idea here. It doesn't have to be ordinary language. It can also be symbolic logic. So for example, if you remember from like high school set theory and stuff, symbols like member of the set, not member of the set, subset, not a subset, union, intersection, that kind of thing. Or just in basic algebra, not equals, less than or equal to, greater than equal to, that sort of thing. So it doesn't matter what the symbolization is, but they have to be propositions, which means grammatically correct within the laws of grammar of that particular way of communicating, whether it's symbolic logic or mathematics or just plain a language like English. So that would mean a proposition is what makes sense. Nothing makes sense outside of propositions, and therefore there can't be any knowledge outside of propositions. And so also from this perspective, outside this category, propositional knowledge, everything else is nonsense. All the first three are nonsense, and so are the two that I'm about to speak about. So this seems pretty much not very well suited to visual art, seems very clearly not suited to visual art, and it does suggest that this entire idea of saying that visual art produces knowledge might be really fundamentally misguided. That's entirely possible, but it doesn't mean that these other formulations can't be really useful. Practical knowledge is something that you know how to do, but either you can't put it in words or you can't put too much of it into words, or it wouldn't do any good to put it in words. So for example, playing the piano. This is from a pianist who makes videos, who posts her videos on YouTube, Tiffany Poons. She's a professional pianist, and she likes to make videos of herself practicing and making mistakes. And they're annotated with all the mistakes that it helps people to be able to hear them, because if you're trying to learn the piano, then it does help to have some things put in words, but you can't, of course, sit down and explain to someone how to play the piano. Same thing with riding a bicycle and any number of other activities. So practical knowledge is something that you know how to do, or if you want to say your body knows how to do it, it's kinesthetic or embodied knowledge. You could think of it that way, or it's just habit. These are words that have been very widely theorized in and around psychology and art education and other fields. Practical knowledge, though, is either something that's not quite entirely amenable to being put in words, or that it's just not worth it if it could be. And last, phenomenal knowledge. Phenomenal knowledge is the kind of knowledge you have if you've had an experience that is incredibly intense or immersive or absorptive, and so it was just kind of overwhelming. Way too much information, you might say, and it can't be put fully in words for that reason. That's phenomenal knowledge. So there are the 6 of them altogether. Are any of them the right words for what happens in visual art? It's not really that clear. So the second one seems to be perfect, just because visual knowledge is a direct description of the kind of thing that people would like to say about their work, but it's not clear how visual knowledge is knowledge. It seems like the word is wrong there. And the third one and the fourth one, they can seem too logical. They can seem too much like science or criticism. So you can consider a list like this, and you can ask if your work, if you think of your work as having anything to do with knowledge, if any of these fit it. And if not, it's also possible to bypass this word knowledge completely, which solves a certain number of these problems. In art education in the last 20 or so years, especially since the rise of the word research, as in the previous lecture, knowledge is pretty much universally used to describe what it is that art produces, especially higher levels like the MFA and the PhD. It's universal at those levels. When people talk about research, they're also going to be talking about knowledge. But here are some alternatives that were, in some cases, widely discussed before modernism and before these advanced degrees. First is understanding. The German philosopher Wilhelm Dilthey made a distinction between understanding and explanation. His idea was that explanation is what the sciences do, and understanding is what the arts and humanities do. He was really not writing about visual art. He's writing about humanities and arts in general, and setting them apart from sciences and engineering and other fields. The notion is that visual art doesn't explain anything. Sometimes it seems to, but that's a misapplication of the forms of thinking that go into the sciences. Visual art, Dilthey says, just helps us to understand things. Understanding is a perfectly reasonable word, and it seems to me that a lot of problems could have been avoided if people had gotten to use this word habitually instead of the word knowledge to use with research, because you can also say that research produces understanding. If you read something that's new, whether it's science or anything else, you could say, oh yes, now I understand. And that's a word that also seems to fit art fairly well. You might prefer expression, that your art is expressive and that it expresses something as opposed to creating knowledge or understanding. And here a source that you could use is the English philosopher Robin Collingwood. He developed a theory of expression. In this case, he was thinking about art, including visual art. He defined expression as being a part of consciousness, by which he meant awareness and self-reflexivity and introspection and so on, and as a part of individuation, which is the development of a unique personality and viewpoint. So, in his way of thinking, what art should do is be expressive in order to help people become more reflective, more aware, more introspective, and also more fully themselves, more individuated. And this is a way of thinking about what art does that's compatible with a wide range of different kinds of schools and styles, not just contemporary art, but before. So it's also available. I suppose the drawback of this, from the point of view of people in the programs like MFAs and PhDs who are really involved in research, is that it doesn't seem like this is something that you can say too much about. It's a little bit hard to teach, maybe impossible to teach, and something more to do with one of art's underlying purposes rather than its capacity to produce something that might approximate to knowledge. And the last alternative I want to mention is meaning. There's a German art theorist named Gottfried Böhm who's explored the possibility that art may not produce knowledge but meaning. So he says that images are a combination of the purely visual and the linguistic, which is something that I talked about in one of the first concepts lectures. But when he says this, he doesn't mean that, for example, you put some words into a painting or you use text, or you have them in a video or photograph, something like that. When he says that visual art can combine or does combine the visual and linguistic, what he means is they're fused in all visual art, no matter whether the art actually contains, say, writing or not. He calls this kind of meaning iconic logos. So that expression, iconic logos, is almost a contradiction in terms. It has two words in it that can be, in some contexts, exact opposites. Iconic and logos, you could translate that as, well, the roots are like image and word or picture and word, but I suppose that you could translate that into a longer expression by saying that visual art is a kind of word which is a pictured word, or the other way around. It's a fused object, so it's not word by itself or image by itself. An object like that couldn't tell you anything directly in language. There would be no way to extract knowledge from an artwork. You could do it, of course, everybody does, But I mean, from his point of view, that would be ignoring essential properties of what makes the work visual art. The iconic logos presents a tremendous challenge because it's not something that you can fully analyze as either nonverbal, only forms and colors and things like that, or entirely verbal, as in a conceptual art piece with a text in it or something like that. But every artwork, in his way of thinking, possesses something called an iconic logos, and it is the goal of a critic and a historian or a theorist to try to be faithful to that, to try to get as close to it as possible, and at the same time not break it down into its constituent parts, because that would be to mistake what the visual is. So meaning in this particular sense is an alternative also to knowledge, because you can write, and Böhm has written, long analyses of particular works of visual art for meaning in this sense, and at the same time avoided words like knowledge. Okay, I want to close with some slides on deconstruction. This is a philosophic strategy or a movement that was theorized and also exemplified by the French-Algerian philosopher Jacques Derrida. It involves a completely different approach to this question, and I can exemplify both deconstruction and Derrida's strategy here with a passage that's in the introduction to one of his books. This is the book. It's the principal collection of his essays on art, although he also wrote a book on drawing and a number of essays on photography and other subjects. Derrida takes his title, this book, from a letter that Cézanne wrote, in which Cézanne says, "I owe you the truth in painting." It's a funny thing to say. I mean, you could interpret it in a really simple way. Maybe he's just saying, I promised you a good painting. I'll send you a good painting, something like that. But in the introduction to this book, Derrida suggests 4 different things that it might mean to say that truth is in painting, and by extension, in any visual art. So each one of these works by way of a different preposition. The first one is truth as images. So that preposition as is going to change in the next 3. But in this first one, first interpretation, truth as images means that the painting, the artwork itself, is the truth that it represents. So this is a little bit like in the case of Dion, of Mark Dion's work. It would be, or Fred Wilson's work, it would be like saying that their installations, their exhibitions, are the truth itself, nothing beyond it. The painting itself says something about the world and about itself simply by existing. So it's a kind of wordless knowledge. That's a Glenn Ligon. I'm going to illustrate these with Glenn Ligon pieces. Obviously, that doesn't fit Fred Wilson very well because there are a lot of things that you would want to say about his installations beyond the fact that they simply are themselves. They definitely point outside themselves. But this is the first of the meanings that Derrida lists. Second is truth through images. The artwork gives us access to some truth by representing it visually. That would fit this Ligon piece a bit better. So if a person praying in front of an icon, for example, believes that the image embodies a divine truth, they believe they're seeing the truth through the image. That would be an example as well. An artwork can be, in this way of thinking, a way of getting at the truth or projecting the truth for the viewer. And this does fit Fred Wilson's work because that's the feeling that you get when you look at some of his installations, that you're learning something about the world because it's been represented to you visually. Third is truth in images. In this case, an artwork can give us a particular kind of truth depending on its medium. And if the artwork were redone in a different medium, it would create a different truth. You might get a certain kind of truth about the world from a painting, another from a performance, another in a video, and that's in this case. It's a painted neon piece, so different medium, and therefore different truth than if it had been in painting or stenciled and so on, like the others. So this is like the second possibility, except that the medium matters. When Cézanne said, "I owe you the truth in painting," he meant, and not in sculpture, drawing, or architecture. And fourth, according to Derrida, the Cézanne statement could have meant truth in materiality. And here the substance of the image itself is what carries the truth. Paint itself is what carries the truth. And this has also been claimed in a different way by the art historian Hubert Damisch, who has argued that paint thinks, that paint itself is what has the meaning entirely outside of language. This is different from claiming that it's the medium that has the truth, because in this case you're really just talking about the substance itself. So this is a philosophic speculation, of course, and these are a little hard to square with actual examples. Sometimes they fit, sometimes they don't, and you may wonder if maybe they all make equal kinds of sense. Maybe it's an apples and oranges sort of list. At any rate, the deconstructive move is still to come. The list is unusual, but the kind of reasoning Derrida is exploring is not unusual, because what he's interested in is different relations between truth and paintings, but also the impetus for that reasoning. So the deconstructive move comes at the end, when he says that all four of these interpretations are ways of answering to the desire that paintings have truth. His own book, he says, will be about, quote, the form of the desire for truth when it comes to painting. So what deconstruction is doing here is changing the conversation in order to show that what seemed to make sense, the four answers, if you, to the extent that you believe them, and at any rate they were systematic and they were making sense out of an enigmatic statement of Cézanne's. But he's showing that these four answers that seem to make sense all depend on not thinking about a fifth term, which in this case would be desire. The desire that paintings have truth is what drives the entire idea of dividing Cézanne's statement into four and trying to make them systematic and trying to make them work. That's the deconstructive move, because it changes the conversation by looking at what is driving the text and yet is not noticed by the text. When you're busy listing your four and trying to find examples like I was and trying to make them fit different artists, at that moment you're not noticing that your drive to system and classification in this case is driven by this desire in regard to painting and truth. So, in conclusion, it's a good exercise, I think, to see which one of these theories that you like, and to ask yourself if your artwork does seem to have something to say. Is that message, is the meaning of your artwork in the artwork itself? Or is it something that people say when they look at it? Something that comes out in critiques, something that comes out in instruction? Does your artwork make use of tacit knowledge? Is it something that you work on and find your way toward a kind of clarity as you go, so that when it's at maximum clarity you stop? Or is your work maybe more about phenomenal knowledge? That is to say, you want it to be kind of overwhelming and immersive, and that produces its knowledge, which can therefore never be put into words? Is it more like practical knowledge? Is it something that you can work on over and over and over again, or for a protracted period of time, getting better and better at it, and as you go farther and farther into your practice, are you also getting farther and farther away from being able to explain what you're doing in words? You can see how, if I put it this way, lots of these different theories can fit. The one that seems to me not to fit is just the word knowledge itself. And if you feel that way, if you feel uncomfortable talking about knowledge in relation to your work, would understanding or expression or meaning be better? And if there are other words beyond those, what would they be? And how would they be related to these words?